Infertile rancher won a teenage girl in a poker game. That's what the saloon will talk about till the snow melts. But what they won't say out loud is why he put down every chip he had to take her from the man who owned her. Out on the frozen street, boots crunch in silence. Folks lean on hitch rails, wondering what a man with no family wants with a girl half-starved and wearing a rope for a belt. He takes her past the church, past the sheriff's window, to a lonely ranch, where the wind never stops. But a secret rides under his coat, one that could rip the valley apart. The girl carries more than fear in her pocket. She carries a claim that can shatter the railroad's grip and bring guns to every door in town. This space is built on something simple and enduring: the power of love, the truth in kindness, and the belief that quiet care can still change lives. Copper Lantern's smoky air hung thick with tension as Rafe Callahan studied his cards. His bad leg, stiff from the cold, throbbed beneath the rough-hewn table. The saloon's tin lanterns cast dancing shadows across weathered faces, miners with coal-stained hands, drifters seeking warmth, and Sam Harlan, the railroad foreman whose red face gleamed with sweat despite the winter chill outside. Rafe had come for the money. Harlan owed him $30 for winter hay. Instead, he found himself in a game he hadn't meant to join, the pot growing larger with each hand. The heavy coins clinked as another miner tossed them in, adding to the stack. "Ain't got no more cash," Harlan announced, swaying slightly. He yanked a rope, and from the shadows emerged a young Apache girl. Her dark eyes flashed with quiet fury despite the bindings at her wrists. "But I got something better. Government paper says she's mine to trade." The girl stood straight-backed, dignity intact despite her ragged clothes, and the rope burns visible on her slender wrists. She couldn't have been more than 16, yet her gaze held the weight of someone who had seen too much. The room fell silent save for the crackle of the pot-bellied stove. Even the piano player's fingers stilled on the keys. Rafe's throat tightened as he looked at the girl, then at his cards. "That ain't right," someone muttered. But the dealer, a thin man with tobacco-stained fingers, merely shrugged. "Law's the law. If he's got papers, it's a legal bet." The dealer's voice carried no emotion. "You in or out, Callahan?" Rafe's fingers tightened around his cards. The girl hadn't moved, hadn't begged or pleaded. She simply watched, her eyes meeting his with a challenge he couldn't ignore. His gut churned at the thought of her fate if he folded. "I'm in." His voice came out rougher than intended. He pushed his remaining chips forward, the scrape of wood on wood loud in the hushed room. Harlan's lips curved in an ugly smile as he laid down his cards. 3 kings. Rafe took a slow breath, then spread his cards on the green felt. Straight. Flush. The smile vanished from Harlan's face. He half rose, chair scraping back. "Now wait, just a bet's a bet," the dealer cut in firmly. "Fair and square." Rafe stood, ignoring the protest of his bad leg. He crossed to where the girl stood and drew his knife. She tensed, but didn't flinch as he cut through the ropes binding her wrists. Without a word, he shrugged out of his sheepskin coat and draped it around her shoulders. Whispers followed them as he guided her toward the door. Some spoke of his kindness. Others questioned his motives with darker implications. He ignored them all, focused only on getting her to safety. The bitter January wind hit them like a physical blow as they stepped outside. Snow had started falling. Again, thick flakes catching in the girl's dark hair. She pulled his coat tighter but made no sound as they crunched through the fresh powder toward the livery stable. "Got a name?" Rafe asked quietly. She was silent so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then barely above a whisper, "Taya." He nodded, not pushing for more. The livery's lantern cast a warm glow across the snow as they approached. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, nickered softly in greeting. "My ranch is about 5 miles out," he told her as he checked the saddle cinch. "It ain't much, but you'll have a proper roof and decent meals." He paused, then added, "You'll be safe there." Taya said nothing, but when he offered his cupped hands to help her mount, she accepted. Her fingers were ice cold against his calloused palms. She settled into the saddle like someone who knew horses well, and he noted that for future reference. Rafe swung up behind her, trying to leave as much space as propriety allowed. The town was already buzzing with gossip. No need to add fuel to those fires. He clicked to the horse, and they moved out into the snowy night, leaving the warm glow of San Miguel behind them. The saloon door banged open. Harlan's voice carried on the wind. "You'll regret this, Callahan." "That's my property." Rafe felt Taya stiffen but didn't turn back. The snow was falling harder now, and he had 5 miles of cold trail ahead. What mattered was getting this girl to safety. Tomorrow's troubles would keep until tomorrow. The moonlight cast long shadows across the snow-covered trail as Rafe guided his sorrel gelding westward. Taya sat stiffly in front of him, her shoulders tense beneath his sheepskin coat. Every few minutes, she would glance back over her shoulder, as if expecting to see riders following in their tracks. The bitter wind whistled through the pines, carrying ice crystals that stung their faces. "About 4 more miles," Rafe said quietly, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The horse's hooves made soft crunching sounds in the fresh powder. The small log ranch house finally came into view, a dark shape against the star-filled sky. Rafe helped Taya down from the horse, noting how she moved carefully, likely stiff from the cold ride. Inside, he worked quickly to stoke the pot-bellied stove, adding pinyon pine chunks until the metal glowed cherry red. "Sit close to the heat," he told her, gesturing to his single wooden chair. "I'll warm up some stew." While the cast iron pot bubbled on the stove, Taya remained silent, holding her hands out to the warmth. The firelight softened her features, making her look even younger than he'd first thought. When he handed her a tin bowl of venison stew, she took it with a slight nod, but didn't meet his eyes. "House is yours tonight," Rafe said, gathering his blanket from the narrow bed in the corner. "I'll sleep in the barn loft. Bolts on the inside of the door if you want to use it." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise perhaps, but she remained silent as he limped out into the night. Dawn arrived with frost sparkling on the corral, rails and roosters announcing the sun's return. Rafe was already up, having slept poorly. On the hay, his bad leg protested the cold as he made his way to the house. He found Taya awake, the stove already stoked and his blanket folded neatly on the bed. "Thought you might want to meet the rest of the place," he said after they'd both had coffee. He led her out to the barn, where his milk cow stood in her stall, steam rising from her broad back. "This here's Bessie. She's gentle as they come." 2 barn cats wound around their ankles, meowing for attention. "That's Tom and Sister. Keep the mice down." Taya knelt to stroke Sister's orange fur, the first real smile he'd seen crossing her face. "You're welcome to stay," Rafe said, measuring his words carefully. "Long as you need, until you figure where you want to go. Won't ask you nothing you don't want to tell." Taya's smile faded, and she turned away, focusing on the cat. The message was clear, no questions. About her past or her people. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountains when Eleanor Klein's wagon rattled into the yard. The widow's sharp eyes took in everything as she climbed down from Taya's presence to the 2 breakfast plates on Rafe's rough-hewn table. "Brought you some fresh bread," Mrs. Klein announced, setting a cloth-wrapped loaf on the table. Her tone was casual, but her expression was serious as she pulled Rafe aside. "Town's fair buzzing with talk," she said in a low voice, glancing at Taya, who was quietly clearing the breakfast dishes. "Some saying you've lost your mind, others saying worse. You need to be careful, Rafe Callahan." "Ain't none of their business," Rafe replied. But he knew she was right. Maybe not, but that won't stop them talking. Mrs. Klein's weathered face softened. "Just watch yourself." "And her too." After Mrs. Klein left, Rafe hitched up his wagon for a supply run to town. The early winter sunset was already painting the sky when he loaded the last sack of flour at Whitaker's General Store. The clerk, Pete Hansen, lingered as he totaled the purchases. "Heard you got yourself some company out at the ranch, Pete." Sud, his voice carefully neutral. He scratched at his beard. "Interesting bit of land you're on, you know. Used to be grazing ground for them Apache before the war. That girl's people, they say, had cattle there once upon a time." Rafe let the words settle in his mind as he paid for his goods. The clerk's hint hung in the air like wood smoke. There was more to this situation than a simple poker game. He loaded his wagon quickly, aware of the eyes watching from the street, and turned his horses toward home. The last rays of sunlight were fading as he drove out of town, painting the snow-covered peaks blood red. Behind him, San Miguel's gossip continued to simmer, but ahead lay his ranch, and a young woman whose presence there had suddenly become more complicated than he'd imagined. Dawn brought another bitter morning to the ranch. Rafe watched from the barn doorway as Taya expertly wielded the pitchfork, clearing soiled straw from Bessie's stall. Her movements were quick and efficient, showing she was no stranger to ranch work. "Reckon you've done this before," Rafe said, lifting a fresh bale of hay. Taya nodded but kept working, her breath visible in the cold air. The barn cats wove between their feet, hoping for mice disturbed by the cleaning. Later, they moved to the woodpile behind the house. Rafe demonstrated the proper swing of the axe, but Taya needed little instruction. She split logs with practiced ease, her strokes precise and powerful. Despite the freezing temperature, she worked steadily, stopping only to wipe sweat from her brow. As the sun climbed toward noon, Rafe cleared his throat. "Sunday service is starting soon. Thought we might go, if you're willing." He watched her carefully, not wanting to force the issue. Taya paused mid-swing, then lowered the axe slowly. After a long moment, she gave a slight nod. They rode double again, arriving at the small clapboard church, just as other families were dismounting. The building stood stark white against the winter sky, its bell tower reaching toward heaven like a finger pointing the way. Whispers followed them up the wooden steps, and heads turned as they entered the cramped interior. Reverend Josiah Parker stood at the door, greeting his flock. His weathered face showed surprise when he saw Rafe and Taya approach. "Brother Callahan," he said carefully, extending his hand. "It's been some time since you've joined us." The Reverend's eyes moved to Taya, confusion evident in his expression. Rafe could see the questions forming, the uncertainty about what to make of the situation. The preacher recovered quickly, though, offering Taya a gentle smile. "Welcome, child. All are welcome in God's house." They found seats near the back, where the winter light streaming through frosted windows cast long shadows across the rough-hewn pews. Throughout the service, Rafe felt the weight of stares from the congregation. Taya sat perfectly still beside him, her face a mask of careful neutrality. As they filed out after the final hymn, Sam Harlan's bulk blocked their path at the bottom of the church steps. His face was flushed, whether from drink or anger, Rafe couldn't tell. "Well, if it ain't the Indian lover," Harlan sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Parading around stolen property like you got some right." He spat in the snow at Rafe's feet, the glob dark against the white ground. Rafe felt Taya tense beside him. He kept his voice level, though his hand instinctively moved closer to his gun. "Step aside, Harlan." Several long seconds passed before Harlan moved, his lips twisted in an ugly smile. Rafe helped Taya mount up, conscious of the townspeople watching, and they rode home in silence. That evening, with a full moon riding high in the sky, Rafe made his usual check of the pasture fences. The snow reflected the moonlight so brightly. He could see clear as day. Near the north corner, he found several posts loosened by frost heave that needed attention. As he turned back toward the house, He remembered he'd left his heavy gloves in his coat pocket, the same coat he'd given Taya that first night. She'd hung it by the door when they'd returned from church. Rafe retrieved it, and as he reached into the pocket, his fingers brushed against something leather. He pulled out a small, worn pouch. Inside was a carefully folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Even in the moonlight, he could make out official-looking marks and what appeared to be treaty language. Strange symbols marked the corners, perhaps Apache writing. A floorboard creaked behind him. Taya stood in the doorway, her face hard as stone. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps and snatched the pouch from his hands, clutching it to her chest like it was worth more than gold. Rafe raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. "I wasn't prying, was just looking for my gloves." Taya backed away, her eyes never leaving his face. She disappeared into the bedroom he'd given her, closing the door firmly behind her. The next morning, steam rose from their coffee cups as they sat at the rough-hewn table. Outside, the wind whistled through the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "Listen," Rafe said quietly, turning his cup between his palms. "I don't know what that paper means, and I won't ask if you don't want to tell me. But if trouble's coming, I need to know. You're safe here, Taya. That's a promise." She stared into her coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. The morning light caught the sharp angles of her face, highlighting the worry there. But she remained silent, keeping whatever secrets that treaty paper held locked away behind her careful mask. 3 days after their quiet breakfast, dark clouds rolled in from the mountains, bringing a fierce snowstorm that howled like a wounded beast. The wind drove thick flakes sideways, piling drifts against the cabin walls until the windows were half buried. Inside, the fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the plank floor. Rafe sat in his oak rocking chair, working. Saddle leather with practiced hands. The worn tack needed mending. Winter was hard on leather goods. Across from him, Taya perched on a wooden stool, watching the flames with distant eyes. The storm's lonely sound made the silence between them feel heavier than usual. Rafe threaded his needle carefully, considering his words. "Storm like this reminds me of the winter of '73, he said quietly. "Lost 2 good horses that year." Taya's eyes flickered to his face, then back to the fire. Her fingers worried at the hem of her worn dress. "Reckon you've seen worse winters, though," Rafe continued, keeping his voice gentle. "Up in the mountains?" Minutes ticked by on the mantel clock before Taya spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 winters ago, worst storm I ever saw." Rafe's hand stilled on the leather. It was the most she'd said since arriving. "That when you lost your folks?" he asked softly. She nodded, drawing her knees up to her chest. "Raiders came in the night. Through the snow, my father." Her voice caught. "My mother told me to run. To take the pouch and never let it go." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind moaned through the eaves. "Been moving between camps since then," she continued. "My uncle, before he died, he told me what the paper meant. Said it was proof that this valley belonged to my family, for grazing. Army made a treaty with our band." Rafe set aside his work, leaning forward. "That why Harlan had you? He knew about the treaty?" Taya's jaw tightened. "He found out somehow. Tried to make me give him the paper. Said he'd let me go if I did." The storm raged for 2 more days before the sky finally cleared, revealing an eye. World transformed by white. Rafe saddled his horse early that morning, the snow crunching under the geldings' hooves as they made their way into town. The telegraph office was barely warm, its pot-bellied stove struggling against the winter chill. Rafe paid 35 cents to send his message to the county seat, requesting any records about Apache grazing rights in the San Miguel Valley. The operator's eyebrows rose as he tapped out the message, but he kept his thoughts to himself. When Rafe returned home, The smell of cooking meat greeted him before he'd even dismounted. Inside, he found Taya stirring a pot of venison stew that filled the cabin with rich, savory aromas. His old barn coat lay across her lap, its torn sleeve now perfectly mended. "Didn't have to do that," he said, hanging his hat by the door. "You gave me shelter," she replied simply. "It's right to give back." They ate their supper in comfortable silence, sharing fresh bread and stew. For the first time since her arrival, the air between them felt easy, unmarked by fear or suspicion. Through the window, the setting sun painted the snow-covered yard in shades of pink and gold dot as darkness fell. Rafe lit the oil lamp on the table. Its gentle glow had barely filled the room when the sound of approaching horses cut through the quiet evening. Rafe was on his feet instantly, reaching for the shotgun mounted above the door. "Stay inside," he told Taya, moving to the window. Through the glass, he could make out 5 riders in the yard, their horses stamping in the snow. He recognized 2 of them as Harlan's regular hands. Rafe stepped onto the porch, shotgun held. "Ready but not aimed. Something I can help you boys with?" A man with a red bandana wrapped around his neck spoke up. "Harlan sent us to collect what's his. Hand over the girl, Callahan. Ain't worth the trouble she bring you. She ain't property," Rafe said evenly. "And she ain't going anywhere she doesn't want to go." "Don't be stupid, Callahan," another rider called out. "You really want to die over some Indian squaw?" Rafe worked the shotgun's action, the sound sharp in the cold air. "First man sets foot on my porch dies where he stands. Rest of you can explain to Harlan why you're short a hand." The riders shifted in their saddles, exchanging glances. After a long moment, Red Bandana spat into the snow. "This ain't over, Callahan. Harlan says to tell you, you just bought yourself a world of trouble." They wheeled their horses around and rode off into the gathering dark, their threats hanging in the frozen air behind them. Dawn painted the eastern sky in streaks of pink and gold as Rafe rode into town, frost crackling under his horse's hooves. The sheriff's office sat between the general store and the blacksmith shop, its wooden steps worn smooth by years of boots. Inside, Sheriff Dobbs lounged behind his desk, coffee cup in hand, his tin star gleaming dully in the early light. "Harlan's men came to my place last night," Rafe said without preamble. 5 of them, armed, making threats. Dobbs took a slow sip of coffee. "That so? You know it is. Town ain't that big. Word travels fast." Rafe planted both hands on the desk, leaning forward. "I'm telling you official-like now. They threatened violence on my property." The sheriff set down his cup with deliberate care. "Look here, Callahan, you want my honest advice? Let the girl go. Ain't worth the trouble she bring. That's your answer? Just hand her over." Dobbs shrugged, his chair creaking as he leaned back. "Railroad pays good money to keep commerce flowing smooth through this valley. Pays my wages, pays for them new school books, pays for most everything that makes this town run. Man be a fool to go against that kind of influence." Disgusted, Rafe turned and strode out, letting the door bang shut behind him. His next stop was the small white church on the edge of town, where Reverend Parker was sweeping snow from the steps. The preacher looked up as Rafe approached, reading the frustration on his face. "Sheriff wasn't helpful, I take it?" "Man's bought and paid for." Rafe dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. "Railroads got him in their pocket." Parker propped his broom against the church wall. "Come inside where it's warmer. I've been meaning to speak with you about Taya's situation anyway." Inside the church, morning light filtered through frosted windows, casting pale squares on the wooden pews. The Reverend led Rafe to his small office, where a pot-bellied stove radiated welcome heat. "There might be a way to protect her legally," Parker said, settling behind his desk. "If you filed guardianship papers, it would give you authority to keep her safe until she comes of age. No one could claim her as property then. She'd be under your legal protection." Rafe's throat tightened. Guardianship? That's a mighty big step, Reverend. It is, Parker agreed. You'd be taking responsibility for her welfare, her education, her future. But consider the alternative, leaving her vulnerable to men like Harlan. The weight of it settled on Rafe's shoulders like a heavy winter coat. Legal guardianship meant commitment, meant family. After Mary died, he'd sworn he was done with family. The ride home gave him plenty of time to think. The sun climbed higher, melting the frost and turning the packed snow to slush. As he approached his ranch, he saw smoke rising straight and steady. From the chimney inside, he found the cabin transformed. The pantry shelves had been reorganized, with preserved fruits and vegetables arranged by type. Dried herbs hung in neat bundles from the ceiling beams. Through the window, he could see Taya in the barn, carefully brushing down the milk cow while talking to it softly in Apache. That evening, after supper was cleared away, they sat by the fire. The flames cast warm light on Taya's face as she mended. A torn shirt. Something about her quiet efficiency, her careful attention to detail, reminded him painfully of Mary. Had a wife once, he said suddenly, surprising himself. Mary, lost her to fever 6 years ago. Taya's hands stilled on her work, but she didn't look up. We wanted children, something fierce, he continued, his voice rough. Tried for years. Doctor finally told me it was my fault. Something wrong with me meant I couldn't father children. He stared into the fire. Thought that was the end of family for me. Figured God had other plans. The fire popped and crackled in the silence that followed. Finally, Taya set aside her mending and looked at him directly. Then maybe God sent me, she said simply. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Rafe felt something shift in his chest, like ice breaking up on a spring river. This girl who'd landed in his life through a poker game, maybe she was right. Maybe there was purpose in it all. They sat together in comfortable silence as the fire burned low, each lost in their own thoughts about family, about belonging, about the strange ways God sometimes answered prayers. A week of anxious waiting passed like molasses in winter. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountain peaks when hoofbeats echoed across the frozen yard. Rafe stepped onto the porch, one hand near his holster, but relaxed when he saw the blue uniform of a United States Army officer. Lieutenant Aaron Grayson dismounted with practiced ease, his brass buttons gleaming in the pale light. He removed his hat, revealing close-cropped brown hair, and offered a crisp salute. Mr. Callahan? Lieutenant Grayson, Army Corps of Engineers. I have information regarding your telegraph inquiry. Taya appeared in the doorway, her dark eyes watchful. The lieutenant acknowledged her with a respectful nod, before pulling a leather document case from his saddlebag. The treaty is legitimate, he announced, spreading several papers on the rough-hewn kitchen table. Still on file at the county seat. These maps show the original grazing boundaries granted to the White Mountain Apache Band, including this entire valley. Rafe leaned over the documents, his finger tracing the familiar contours of the land. And Taya's claim? As the sole surviving heir of her family line, she has legal right to petition for formal recognition. Grayson's expression grew serious. But you should know, the railroad's been buying up land all through these parts. They'll try to seize this valley, treaty or no treaty. Taya's hands gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white. They cannot. Take what is not theirs. No, they cannot, Grayson agreed. Not legally. Which is why you need to file your claim properly at the agency office. He straightened his uniform jacket. I can escort you there myself. Having an army presence might discourage any interference. Rafe exchanged a look with Taya. She gave a slight nod. Much obliged, Lieutenant, Rafe said. We'll ride out tomorrow morning. Dawn brought bitter winds howling down from the mountains, driving needle-sharp ice crystals before them. Rafe, Taya, and Lieutenant Grayson wrapped themselves in heavy coats and scarves, their breath freezing in white clouds around their faces. The horses picked their way carefully along the snow-packed trail. Heads lowered against the wind out by mid-afternoon. The weather had worsened. Grayson pulled his horse alongside Rafe's. "Mrs. Klein's ranch is just ahead. We should stop there for the night. No sense risking the passes in this weather." Eleanor Klein's ranch house appeared through the swirling snow like a harbor light. Windows glowing warm and welcoming. The widow herself came out to meet them, her gray hair escaping from its bun in the wind. "Lord above, you'll catch your death out there." She hustled them inside, clucking like a mother hen. "Get those wet things off and come near the fire. I've got coffee brewing and some bean soup staying warm." Soon they were settled around Mrs. Klein's kitchen table, thawing their frozen fingers. Around 10 cups of strong coffee. The wind rattled the windows, but inside was warm and snug, smelling of wood smoke and fresh-baked bread. "So you're going to claim your land proper," Mrs. Klein said to Taya, spooning more soup into her bowl. "Good. About time someone stood up to those railroad men." "The lieutenant says the treaty is valid," Rafe explained. "Once it's registered at the agency office, papers won't change some folks' minds." Mrs. Klein interrupted, her voice gentle, but firm. She turned to Taya. "I'm not saying this to discourage you, child. But you need to know, there's them that won't accept you owning this land, no matter what documents you have." Taya met the older woman's gaze steadily. "I know this. But the land was my father's, and his father's before him. It is mine now." Mrs. Klein reached across the table and patted Taya's hand. "That it is, child, that it is." Lieutenant Grayson cleared his throat. "The Army will uphold legal claims, Mrs. Klein, if the railroad attempts to seize treaty-protected land." "Oh, I don't doubt your intentions, Lieutenant," Mrs. Klein said. "But I've lived out here 30 years. Seen how things work. Sometimes paper law and actual law ain't quite the same thing." They sat in thoughtful silence as the wind moaned around the eaves. Finally, Mrs. Klein stood and began clearing the dishes. "Well, no use borrowing trouble before it comes. Taya, you can share my room tonight. Gentlemen, I've got blankets for you by the fire." Later, as Rafe settled onto his bedroll, he could hear Mrs. Klein and Taya talking softly upstairs, their words indistinct but their tone warm and companionable. Outside, the bitter wind continued to blow, but inside Mrs. Klein's house, there was warmth, safety, and the promise of justice to come. The reservation agency stood like a weathered sentinel against the gray winter sky, its clapboard walls bleached by countless seasons. Rafe, Taya, and Lieutenant Grayson dismounted, their boots crunching in day-old snow. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of weak sunlight filtering through grimy windows out behind a high desk. The clerk, Mr. Evans, peered at them through wire-rimmed spectacles. His fingers, stained with ink, drummed against the scarred wooden surface. "Treaty records, you say?" Lieutenant Grayson stepped forward, his presence lending authority to their request. "Yes, concerning the San Miguel Valley grazing rights. White Mountain Apache Band, circa 1862. Evans shuffled through a tower of leather-bound volumes, muttering under his breath. The office smelled of old paper and wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove in the corner. Finally, he pulled out a thick ledger and laid it open with exaggerated care. "Here we are." His finger traced down columns of faded writing. "Yes, ... Territory granted to Standing Bear's band, including water rights and seasonal grazing privileges." He glanced at Taya. "You claim direct descent?" "He was my grandfather," Taya said quietly. "My father was Swift Arrow." Evans made a notation, his pen scratching against paper. "And you can prove this lineage?" Lieutenant Grayson produced several sworn statements he'd gathered from the Army post and tribal elders. Evans examined each document with painful slowness, while Rafe stood sentinel-like beside Taya, his presence steady and protective. "Everything appears to be in order," Evans finally declared. He pulled out fresh forms and began copying information in his precise handwriting. I'll file the claim today, marking you, Miss Taya, as rightful heir to the treaty lands. Rafe felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but Evans wasn't finished. However, the clerk continued, processing will take weeks, possibly months. These things move slowly through official channels. He gave them a thin-lipped smile, particularly when certain interested parties might raise objections. The railroad, you mean, Rafe said flatly. Evans shrugged. I merely process the paperwork. Sir, politics are not my concern. They left the agency as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. Dark clouds were building in the west, and the wind carried the promise of more snow. They'd made it halfway home when the storm hit, turning the world into a howling white blur. Line shack ahead, Lieutenant Grayson shouted over the wind. Used by the Army Patrol, we can wait it out there. The abandoned line shack was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it offered blessed shelter from the driving snow. They led the horses into the lean-to, then hurried inside. Rafe found a half-full oil lamp and some dry kindling. Soon, a small fire crackled in the crude stone fireplace. Lieutenant Grayson insisted on taking first watch, leaving Rafe and Taya to share the warmth of the fire. They sat in comfortable silence, watching shadows dance on rough-hewn walls. The storm raged outside, but inside was almost peaceful. I thought you would sell me, Taya said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, like the others. Rafe turned to look at her, seeing not just the young woman she was becoming, but the scared child she must have been, passed from hand to hand like trading goods. Without a word, he reached into his coat and pulled out the small Bible he always carried. On this good book, he said solemnly, I swear I will never sell you or send you away against your will. He met her eyes steadily. You're not property. Taya, you never were. She touched the worn leather cover of the Bible with gentle fingers. I believe you, she said simply. They spent the night in shifts, keeping the fire fed while the storm gradually spent its fury. By morning, the sky had cleared to a crystal blue, and fresh snow blanketed the world in pristine white. They bid farewell to Lieutenant Grayson, who needed to report back to his post, and turned their horses toward home. The ride back was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Gone was the wariness, the careful distance they'd maintained. In its place was something new, a comfortable understanding, a trust built on actions rather than words. Rafe glanced at Taya, riding tall and straight in her saddle. She caught his look and gave him a small smile, the first real smile he'd seen from her. His heart warmed at the sight, even as the winter sun glinted off endless fields of snow around them. February brought deeper cold to the San Miguel Valley. Snow drifted against the barn walls, and icicles grew long from the eaves of Rafe's ranch house. But inside, warmth and purpose filled the rooms that had stood empty for so long. Each morning, Rafe watched from the kitchen window as Taya trudged through knee-deep snow to feed the livestock. She'd taken to the work like she'd been born to it. The draft horses, massive Belgians with feathered feet, would lift their heads and nicker at her approach. Easy now, Rafe instructed one crystal-clear morning, demonstrating how to slip the heavy leather harness over the horse's broad shoulders. They're gentle giants, but you've got to show them respect. Taya nodded, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Her small hands worked the buckles with growing confidence. Soon she could harness the team alone, leading them to pull logs for the woodpile or break paths through the deepening snow dot in the kitchen. The wood stove became her domain. Mrs. Klein had dropped by with her biscuit recipe, and now the smell of baking bread often filled the house. Taya's first attempts had been hard as rocks, but she'd persisted until she mastered the technique. Patience and a light touch, she repeated Mrs. Klein's words, working the dough with flour-dusted hands, like gentling a wild horse. Rafe found himself looking forward to meals now, not just for the food but for the company. They developed an easy routine, sharing the day's work over hot coffee and fresh biscuits. Sometimes in the evenings, he'd tell stories about his cavalry days while she mended clothes by lamplight. When Mrs. Klein came asking for help with sick children in town, Taya didn't hesitate. She rode with the older woman, carrying blankets and medicines to families struck by winter fever. Some mothers initially turned away, but Mrs. Klein's sharp tongue and Taya's quiet competence won them over. "That girl's got healing hands," Mrs. Klein declared over tea one afternoon. "Knew just how to cool little Tommy's fever and got Sarah's baby to keep down milk for the first time in days." Word spread. Soon other women nodded when Taya passed on her rare trips to town. The general storekeeper's wife even smiled and offered her a candy stick. It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was a start. Rafe felt something long dormant stirring in his chest. Hope, maybe. Or the simple joy of having someone to care for again. The house felt lived in now, with Taya's beadwork hanging by the window and her herbs drying from the kitchen rafters. Even the barn cats had grown fat and friendly under her attention, but winter's peace proved fragile. One bright afternoon, Rafe rode into town for supplies, his wagon creaking through the packed snow. At the blacksmith's shop, old Jake Murphy pulled him aside while fitting new shoes to Rafe's horse. "Heard talk at the saloon," Murphy muttered, hammering at the forge. "Harlan's been flashing silver around, trying to hire muscle." He glanced up, eyes serious beneath his soot-stained brow. "Says he'll pay good money to anyone willing to solve his Apache problem." Rafe's jaw tightened. "How many takers?" "3. Drifters so far. Mean-looking bunch." Murphy spat into the snow. "Watch your back, Callahan," and hers. That evening, Rafe cleaned his Winchester rifle with extra care, checking and rechecking the action. He'd always kept loaded guns handy, standard practice on the frontier, but now he added extra ammunition boxes near the doors and windows. "Something's wrong," Taya said, watching him work. It wasn't a question. "Just being careful," Rafe replied. But he showed her where he'd hidden spare cartridges and how to work the rifle's lever action if needed. Her hands were steady as she practiced loading and unloading the weapon. That night, instead of sleeping, Rafe sat by the window, rifle across his knees. The moon cast blue shadows on the snow, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled. Every few hours he made a circuit of the barn and corrals, boots crunching in the frozen crust. During one check, he found Taya awake in the kitchen, a cup of coffee waiting for him. "I can take a watch too," she said simply. Rafe started to protest, but stopped himself. She'd earned the right to help defend their home. Their home, the thought struck him suddenly. Somewhere along the way, it had become theirs, not just his. "We'll split the night," he agreed, accepting the coffee. "But you sleep first." She nodded and headed back to her room, pausing at the door. "Thank you," she said softly, "for making this a place worth protecting." Rafe turned back to his vigil, touched by her words but worried about what tomorrow might bring. The winter wind moaned around the eaves, carrying the promise of more snow, and perhaps darker things to come. Late February brought the first hints of spring to the San Miguel Valley. Snow melted into muddy rivulets, and patches of brown grass emerged from beneath their white blanket. The warmer air carried the promise of change, the weather for good. Or ill remained to be seen. Rafe stood on his porch at sunset, studying the sagging fence lines revealed by the thaw. Years of harsh winters had taken their toll on the posts and wire. He made mental notes of where repairs were most needed, his experienced eye marking the weak spots. "We'll need fresh posts there, and there," he pointed, teaching Taya as she stood beside him. "Come spring proper, we'll have our work cut out for us." The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Rafe was pulling on his boots when the sharp crack of rifle fire split the air. 2 shots in quick succession, followed by the panicked lowing of cattle. "Stay inside." He shouted to Taya, grabbing his Winchester from beside the door. But she was already moving, her own rifle in hand. They raced toward the pasture, boots squelching in the half-frozen mud. Two of Rafe's best steers lay dead in the grass, dark blood staining the melting snow around them. Clean shots through the head. This was no random predator attack. Rafe's jaw clenched as he surveyed the damage. Each steer represented months of work and feed, not to mention their value at market. "Rafe!" Taya's voice carried from the direction of the barn. He turned to find her standing before the wide double doors, staring at something nailed there. A rough wooden sign, letters carved crude and deep. "Apache land is for the taking." Anger rose hot in Rafe's chest, but his voice remained steady. "Get inside the house. Bar the door and windows. Don't open for anyone but me, but no arguments." "Not this time." He caught her eye, letting her see the steel in his gaze. "I need to know you're safe while I handle this." Taya hesitated, then nodded once and headed for the house. Rafe waited until he heard the door bolt slide home before mounting his horse. The ride to town seemed longer than usual, each hoofbeat matching the throbbing in his temples. The copper lantern was already busy despite the early hour. Harlan held court at his usual table, surrounded by three rough-looking men Rafe didn't recognize. The room quieted as Rafe pushed through the batwing doors, his spurs ringing on the wooden floor. "Quite a message you left at my place," Rafe said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "Mighty brave, shooting defenseless animals and running." Harlan's face reddened. "Don't know what you're talking about, Callahan. But since you mention it, that Apache squaw's got no business claiming white man's range. That land's hers by treaty. Legal and proper." Rafe took another step forward. "And those steers were mine." "Treaty?" Harlan spat on the floor. "Ain't worth the paper it's written on. Railroad's coming, Callahan. Best get out of the way." One of Harlan's men moved to flank Rafe. Another shifted left, trying to box him in. Rafe kept his eyes on Harlan, but tracked their movements. "Last warning," Rafe said. "Stay off my land." The first punch came from behind, a sucker shot that caught him just below the ribs. Rafe spun, catching his attacker with an elbow, but the other two were already moving in. He managed to land a solid blow that sent one staggering, but numbers told. A boot caught his bad leg, sending him to one knee. After that, the beating was methodical. When they finally threw him out the door, Rafe lay in the muddy street for a long moment, tasting blood. His old war wounds screamed protest as he forced himself to stand. Curious faces watched from shop windows, but no one moved to help. The ride home was agony. Each step of his horse sent fresh pain through his battered body. His left eye was swelling shut, and breathing hurt enough to suggest cracked ribs. The sky had turned slate gray, threatening rain, but underneath the pain burned something harder than anger, determination. They'd meant to break him, show him how helpless he was. Instead, they'd only proved how far they'd go. And now he knew exactly what he was dealing with. As his ranch came into view, Rafe straightened in the saddle despite the pain. Taya would be watching, worried. He couldn't let her see him beaten, couldn't let her think they'd won. The threats would only get worse from here. They'd need clear heads and steady hands to survive what was coming. The house door opened as he approached. Taya's face appeared, drawn with concern. She said nothing about his injuries, just helped him down from his horse and supported him inside. They had decisions to make, hard ones. But those could wait until he'd cleaned up and rested. For now, it was enough to be home, knowing they still had walls around them and each other to depend on. Lamplight flickered across the cabin's rough-hewn walls as night settled over the ranch. Taya wrung out a cloth in warm water, her movements gentle. As she cleaned the dried blood from Rafe's face, he sat stiffly in his chair by the fire, trying not to wince as she tended his wounds. "Ribs are likely cracked," she said softly, pressing careful fingers along his side. Need wrapping? Rafe nodded, watching her work. Her hands moved with surprising skill, winding strips of clean cloth around his chest. The familiar scent of Mrs. Klein's herbal salve filled the air as Taya dabbed it on his bruises. Which is why you need to go stay with Mrs. Klein for a spell, Rafe said, picking up their earlier argument. At least until this settles. Taya's hands stilled. No. This ain't up for debate. They're getting bolder. Next time we face them together. She met his eyes, chin lifted in that stubborn way he'd come to know. This land mine now too, my people's land. I not running. Rafe sighed, then regretted it as his ribs protested. Taya, you not send me away. She tied off the bandage with firm fingers. I stay, help protect what's ours. The word ours hung in the air between them. Rafe couldn't argue. She'd earned her place here these past weeks. Still, the thought of her in danger twisted something in his gut. Morning brought heavy clouds and the clip-clop of approaching hooves. Reverend Parker dismounted in the yard, his usually neat coat spattered with mud from the ride. Heard about the trouble in town, he said as Rafe met him on the porch. Came to see how you're faring. I'll heal, Rafe said, leading him inside where coffee waited hot on the stove. Taya nodded greeting to the preacher, then slipped outside to give them privacy. Parker watched her go, his weathered face thoughtful. There's a way to protect her. You know, he said finally, warming his hands around his coffee cup. And the land too. Rafe waited, sensing more coming. Marry her. Coffee sloshed as Rafe's hand jerked. What? Hear me out. Parker held up a palm. This isn't about romance. It's about the law. A married woman has more standing in court than an unmarried girl, especially an Indian girl claiming white-owned land. She's barely more than a child, Rafe protested. Old enough to marry by territory law. And you've already taken responsibility. For her welfare, Parker leaned forward. Think, Rafe. The railroad's lawyers will try to dismiss her claim. They'll paint her as a vagrant, question her right to file papers. But a married woman, with a respected rancher for a husband? That's harder to ignore. Rafe stood, pacing despite his injuries. It ain't right, using marriage that way. What's not right is letting them steal her birthright because we stood on ceremony. Parker's voice gentled. You're an honorable man, Rafe. I wouldn't suggest this otherwise. But sometimes doing right means walking an unexpected path. After Parker rode out, Rafe stayed on the porch, watching clouds gather. The preacher's words echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of Mary. What would she think of him considering marriage to a girl half his age, and an Apache at that? For the first time since Mary's death, Rafe felt the need for prayer overwhelming him. He sank to his knees, ignoring the protest of his injuries. Lord, he whispered, voice rough. I ain't been much for talking lately. Reckon I've been angry since you took Mary, but I need guidance now. His hands gripped the porch rail. This girl, she's got no one else. And I promised to protect her. But marriage? He drew a shaky breath. Show me the right path here. Help me see clear what you want done. Wind rustled through bare branches, carrying the first drops of rain. Rafe stayed kneeling, face turned skyward, letting the drops mingle with tears he hadn't shed in years. Behind him, through the window, he heard Taya moving about the cabin, humming softly as she worked, so different from Mary, yet somehow filling the empty spaces just as surely. Whatever you want of me, he whispered finally. Whatever it takes. To keep her safe. Just help me do right by her. Thunder rolled in the distance as Rafe pushed himself to his feet. No clear answer had come, but the act of prayer itself had steadied him. One way or another, decisions would need making soon. For now, there were evening chores waiting, and a girl who trusted him to protect her interests watching from the window. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Rafe stood in the ranch yard, watching Taya check the cinch on her saddle one last time. His ribs still ached something fierce from the beating, and worry gnawed at him like a coyote at old bones. Days had passed since Reverend Parker's visit, bringing fresh troubles with each sunrise. First came the telegraph from the county seat, the railroad's fancy Denver. Lawyers would arrive within the week to resolve outstanding land claims. Then Mrs. Klein rode out yesterday with word that Harlan was strutting around town, boasting how he'd soon own every acre from the creek to the mountains. Taya pulled on thick leather gloves, her breath frosting in the morning air. Uncle Gray Wolf's people always winter near Eagle Creek, 2 days' ride, maybe 3 if snow comes. She spoke with quiet confidence, though Rafe noticed how her fingers worried at the fringe of the buffalo robe he'd dug out of storage for her. "Sure about this?" Rafe asked, not for the first time. Could be dangerous riding alone. More dangerous to face railroad men with no friends. Taya swung into the saddle, settling the heavy robe around her shoulders. "Ute people know these valleys longer than any paper. Maybe they help speak for our right to stay. Our right." The words warmed something in Rafe's chest, despite his worry. She'd grown so much from that rope-bound girl in the saloon, finding her voice, claiming her place. Still. "Take my rifle," he said, holding up the Winchester. "And stay alert. Harlan's got eyes everywhere." Taya nodded, securing the rifle in its scabbard. She'd proven herself a fine shot these past weeks, though Rafe prayed she wouldn't need those. Skills. The morning sun caught the beadwork on her moccasins, Mrs. Klein's Christmas gift, as she gathered her reins. "I come back before lawyers arrive," she promised. 2 days, maybe 3. She hesitated, then added softly, "Take care of yourself, Rafe Callahan." "You too, little sister," he replied, the name feeling right somehow. He stepped back as she turned her horse toward the trail, watching until rider and mount disappeared. Into the thin morning mist the day stretched long without her. Rafe threw himself into work, trying to ignore how empty the ranch felt. He patched loose boards in the barn wall, noting every splinter and nail that might serve as a defensive position if trouble came. His military training from the war crept back, sight lines, cover, approaches to watch. By afternoon, his ribs screamed protest at the labor, but he kept moving. The barn needed securing. The root cellar could hide supplies. The old wagon might make a barrier if pushed across the yard. Every preparation felt like a prayer. "Lord, keep her safe on the trail. Lord, give us strength for what's coming." Evening brought Mrs. Klein with fresh bread and worry lines around her eyes. "Saw some rough-looking men asking directions to your place in town," she said, helping him stack firewood by the door. "Harlan's hired guns, I expect." Rafe nodded, unsurprised. Figured they'd come sniffing around eventually. "You need help here?" "My boys could ride over, stand watch with you." "Much obliged, but no." Rafe straightened carefully, mindful of his ribs. "Don't want to drag your family into this fight." Mrs. Klein's weathered face creased with concern. "You're already family, Rafe Callahan. You and that girl both." She pressed his arm. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing you two together. Don't you forget that." After she left, Rafe sat cleaning his pistol by lamplight, listening to the wind moan through the chimney. The cabin felt too quiet without Taya's soft humming or the click of her needles as she mended. He found himself straining to hear hoofbeats. Though he knew she wouldn't return before tomorrow at earliest, he checked his ammunition again, arranged his tools, swept the floors. Anything to keep moving, to be ready. The lawyers would come with papers and promises, trying to buy what wasn't theirs to take, and if that failed, Harlan's men would try other methods. But Rafe had fought for this land once already, breaking tough soil and enduring lonely years. He'd fight again if needed. Near midnight, an owl called from the cottonwoods. Rafe stood at the window, watching moonlight silver the empty yard. Somewhere out there, Taya rode through the darkness, carrying hope of allies with her. His prayers followed her trail, for safety, for success, for strength to face whatever came next. "Hurry home, little sister," he whispered to the night. "Storms are gathering, and we'll need all the family we can get." Taya's horse picked its way carefully along the snow-dusted trail as afternoon shadows lengthened across Eagle Creek Valley. Her muscles ached from 2 days of hard riding, but hope quickened her heart as she spotted smoke rising above the tree line. The Ute winter camp lay nestled in a protected hollow, just as her uncle had described. Dogs barked an alert as she approached. 2 mounted warriors appeared on either side of the trail, rifles ready but not aimed. Taya raised her empty hands in greeting, speaking the few Ute words she knew. "I seek Chief Running Deer. I bring words from White Mountain Apache." The warriors exchanged glances, then one nodded toward the camp. They escorted her past bark-sided lodges where women paused in their work to watch. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts. The camp smelled of pine smoke and cooking meat, reminding Taya of winters long past. Outside the largest lodge, an elderly man sat wrapped in a striped blanket, his face deeply lined but his eyes sharp. "Running Deer." Taya dismounted slowly, showing respect. She touched her heart, then extended her hand palm up, the gesture her mother had taught her for greeting elders. "My Uncle Gray Wolf traded here," she said clearly. "He spoke of your wisdom. I come seeking help." The chief studied her for a long moment, then gestured for her to sit. A woman brought her a cup of hot tea. Taya warmed her cold fingers against the bark vessel, gathering her thoughts. "The railroad men come to take our grazing lands," she began. "They already steal other people's places. Now they want the valley where my family's cattle once grazed." She drew out the folded treaty paper, handling it carefully. "This shows our right to the land. But they do not honor such things." Running Deer took the document, examining the faded ink and official seals. His expression remained neutral, but his fingers traced the signatures with recognition. "A white rancher protects me now," Taya continued. "Rafe Callahan. He won me from bad men in cards, but treats me like family, defends our claim. Railroad men beat him for it, but still he stands firm." She touched the beaded edge of her moccasins. "Some town people help us too, but railroad lawyers come soon. We need strong friends." The chief passed the treaty to his councilmen, who studied it in turn. The lodge grew quiet except for the crackling fire. Taya sipped her tea and waited, as her mother had taught her patience. Finally, Running Deer spoke, his voice deep and measured. "We know these railroad men. They build their iron road through hunting grounds. Drive away buffalo, break every promise." He gestured to the valley around them. "Soon they will come here too. Better to stand together now." Relief flooded through Taya as he continued. "4 warriors will ride with you. Show these lawyers that old agreements still have teeth." That evening, Taya sat with the women around their cooking fires, helping prepare the evening meal. Her fingers remembered the familiar motions of shaping cornmeal cakes. As they worked, she told them about Rafe, how he had cut her bonds that first night, given her his coat, trusted her with his home and heart. "He cannot have children," she explained, patting another cake into shape. "Lost his wife years ago. But he gives me a father's protection, teaches me ranch work, defends my rights to our land." The women nodded understanding. One elder touched Taya's arm. "The Creator sends family in many forms," she said. "This Callahan, he has honor. Good that you ride together." Taya slept that night in a warm lodge with 3 generations of women, their quiet breathing and the occasional pop of the banked fire lulling her to rest. She dreamed of home, of Rafe checking fences, of Mrs. Klein's fresh bread, of the barn cats purring in the hay. Dawn painted the sky crimson when Taya saddled her horse 2 days later. 4 Ute warriors waited mounted nearby, their horses stamping. In the cold, light snow had begun to fall. frosting their blankets and the horses' manes. Running Deer emerged from his lodge to bid them farewell. "Ride well," he told Taya. "Remember, you do not stand alone." The small party set out as sunrise gilded the peaks. Snow fell harder as they rode, but Taya's heart felt warm despite the weather. She thought of Rafe, probably worrying, probably watching the trail. Soon she would see the ranch again, bringing the help they needed. The warriors rode slightly behind her, 4 silent shadows in the falling snow. Their presence made her sit straighter in the saddle. No longer was she a frightened girl being, passed from camp to camp. She was riding home to the family she had found, to the land that was her birthright, to face whatever battles lay ahead. Dawn crept over the San Miguel Valley, painting the fresh snow in shades of rose and gold. Rafe Callahan stood firm in his ranch yard, the cold February wind tugging at his coat. His Winchester rifle caught the early light as he watched the road. Beside him, Mrs. Eleanor Klein gripped her shawl tight, while Reverend Parker's Bible rested ready in his weathered hands. Hoofbeats thundered from the east. Sam Harlan's group, nearly 20 strong, including 2 men in city suits who had to be the railroad lawyers. They reined up at the yard's edge, dust and snow swirling around their horses' legs. "Last chance, Callahan," Harlan called out, his face red with more than just the morning chill. "Clear out now, or—" The sound of more riders approaching cut him short. From the west came Taya, sitting tall in her saddle, 4 painted boat warriors, riding beside her like honor guards. Their arrival sent a ripple of mutters through Harlan's men. Lieutenant Grayson appeared from behind the barn, timing his entrance perfectly. His cavalry uniform gleamed as he stepped forward, holding up a leather document case. "I have certified copies of the treaty, gentlemen," he announced clearly. "Signed, sealed, and legally binding. This land belongs to Miss Taya through inheritance, recognized by both territorial and federal law." The railroad lawyers exchanged glances, taking in the scene, armed townsfolk standing with Rafe, fierce Ute warriors flanking Taya, and an army officer backing their claim. One lawyer whispered urgently to Harlan, whose face darkened like a thundercloud. "The railroad doesn't want to fight," the lawyer announced stiffly. "We'll seek an alternate route." A cheer went up from the gathered townsfolk. Harlan spat in the snow and wheeled his horse around, riding off to a chorus of jeers and catcalls from the celebrating crowd. Taya dismounted and walked to Rafe's side, standing proud as their allies, both native and settler, gathered around them in victory. The church bell's clear tone rang across the valley as sunset painted the western sky. Townsfolk filed into the white clapboard building, carrying covered dishes and warm greetings. The wooden pews had been pushed back to make room for long tables, draped with checkered cloths. Rafe stood at the front of the room, his good shirt pressed in his grain, hair neatly combed. His throat felt tight as he looked out at the gathered faces, friends and neighbors, who'd stood with them against the railroad. Taya stood beside him in a blue calico dress Mrs. Klein had helped her sew, her dark eyes bright in the lamplight. "Folks," Rafe began, his voice rough with emotion, "I want to introduce you proper to my daughter, Taya Callahan." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The good Lord works in ways we don't always understand, but he surely knew what he was doing when he brought her to my home." Taya looked up at him, her usual reserve melting away. "Thank you, Father," she said softly, the word carrying clearly. In the hushed church dock, tears welled in Rafe's eyes as he pulled her close. The congregation broke into warm applause, led by Reverend Parker's enthusiastic hands. As winter released its grip on the valley, green grass pushed through the melting snow. Rafe and Taya worked side by side to repair winter's damage to the ranch. Her laughter, once so rare, now rang out regularly across the yard as she taught Mrs. Klein's children to ride bareback, showing them how to grip with their knees and balance without a saddle. She shared Apache words with them too, names for Animals and plants making a game of it. That one peaceful evening, Rafe sat at the kitchen table, watching Taya wash dishes by lamplight. The familiar sounds of home surrounded him, the crack of the stove fire, the gentle clinking of tin cups, the low song Taya hummed as she worked. Outside, the last rays of pink sunset bathed the quiet valley. I spent years praying for the family I thought I wanted, Rafe mused, his heart full. But the good Lord knew better. He gave me the family I needed all along. If something today spoke to the part of you that still believes in love, stay a while. Subscribe, I'll be here again tomorrow with another story worth feeling.